Bonsoir tout le monde. Bonsoir. Dear Minister, distinguished guests, and colleagues, my name is Sylvain Charbonneau, and I'm the Vice President Research here at the University of Ottawa, and I'm truly honored to welcome you to this very timely Positive Energy Conference on Public Confidence in Energy Decision Making. Il me fait grand plaisir de vous accueillir sur le campus de l'Université d'Ottawa, situé sur les terres non cédées du peuple algonquin. Il n'y a que 3 ans, Énergie positive est née d'une vision de réunir des représentants du milieu universitaire, des gouvernements, des organismes autochtones et de l'industrie pour discuter des enjeux des politiques énergétiques à l'échelle nord-américaine. 3 years later, the impressive list of experts gathered in this room is testament to the success of positive energy, which is one of a number of initiatives run by the university's Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. This progressive institute is a forum for research, public outreach, and training on the social implication of science and technology. Its aims is to inform public policy. Positive Energy has grown into a well-established North American network. Its contributions to sparkling and developing a conversation in public confidence in energy decision-making has been tremendous. By using the convening power of the university to bring together energy leaders from business, government, Indigenous, and environmental organization like academia, it continues to identify ways to strengthen this public confidence. Positive Energy is an outstanding example of what can be accomplished when academia and the community at large collaborate. It is bolstering the University of Ottawa's reputation as a hub of expertise on energy and environment, public policy, along with sustainable prosperity, our Institute of the Environment, and our recently appointed Canada Research Chair 150 in Economic Innovation and Policy. Il me fait donc plaisir de vous présenter la présidente d'Énergie positive elle-même, une source insatiable d'énergie. Monica Gattinger est professeure à l'École d'études politiques de l'Université d'Ottawa et la directrice de l'Institut de recherche sur la science, la société et les politiques publiques. Elle travaille sans relâche pour fonder l'énergie positive et pour bâtir le réseau d'experts ici assemblés. Je vous souhaite un échange des plus fructueux au cours des prochains jours et vous remercie d'être venu en aussi grand nombre. J'aimerais maintenant inviter Monica à venir dire quelques mots. Merci et bonne soirée.
Merci, Sylvain. Votre bureau a toujours été une instance extrêmement appuyante à nos activités, non seulement dans le cadre de Énergie positive, mais aussi à l'Institut sur la science, la société et la politique publique. Nous sommes très reconnaissantes envers votre appui. Bienvenue tout le monde sur le campus de l'Université d'Ottawa. Pour ceux et celles qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Monica Gattinger et comme a été mentionné, je suis présidente d'Énergie positive. L'événement va se dérouler en anglais, mais si jamais vous avez des questions en français, soyez-vous bien à l'aise de les présenter en français. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this room and also to those of you who are joining us by the live webcast. We're delighted to be able to make these proceedings available via live webcast. And I cannot tell you how pleased I am to be here this evening. 3 years ago, we had a vision to create a neutral, nonpartisan, evidence-based forum to try to identify how we could strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making. We knew that we needed to bring together energy leaders from business, from government, from Indigenous communities, from environmental NGOs, and the Academy to work collectively on how we could strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making. 3 years later, here we are celebrating the conclusion of the first 3 years of Positive Energy. Over the course of that time, we have a growing network and list of supporters. I like to think in many ways of this network of Positive Energy as an expanding tent with more and more people in it who are committed collectively to working on resolving these complex challenges. The list of supporters is multiple, and without their financial assistance, we would not be able to accomplish what it is that we've been undertaking at Positive Energy. And I'd like to list those organizations for you now, many of whom have representatives here in the room. In alphabetical order, Alberta Energy, the Alberta Energy Regulator, the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission, the British Columbia Utilities Commission, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Electricity Association, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, the Canadian Gas Association, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, Cenovus, Encana, and Natural Resources Canada. As you can see, these organizations represent a broad, diverse group, really encompassing the entire energy sector, both from a policy perspective, a regulatory perspective, energy sources, and regions throughout the country. So what have we accomplished over the course of the last 3 years? Not only at Positive Energy, but perhaps more importantly in Canada. What are the things that we have made progress on when it comes to strengthening public confidence in energy decision-making? And what still remains to be done? We invite you to keep those two questions at the forefront of your thinking over the next 24 hours. What have we accomplished? What still needs to be done? This is a marvelous opportunity for us to come together as a community and emerge having made some progress. For now, it gives me tremendous pleasure and honor to introduce the Minister of Natural Resources, who agreed to deliver a keynote address to open up our event. I was at an election party in October 2015, and I can remember when the results were rolling in and all of the winds coming in from across the country, and I recall seeing Jim Carr's face come up on the screen, having been the elected MP for Winnipeg Centre, and I thought, I sure hope that he gets named Minister of Natural Resources. Why did I think that? Because I knew that Minister Carr, not minister yet at that time, but I knew that Minister Carr had been one of the chief architects of the Winnipeg Consensus Group, which had brought together a wide diversity of groups very committed to working on resolving complex energy and environmental challenges in this country. That, to my mind, was precisely the kind of approach that was needed at the federal level when it came to energy. So I can remember, second thing I remember about Minister Carr, sitting in my car, listening to the announcement of who was in the cabinet, and sort of uttering a little yee-hoo when Minister Carr was indeed named Minister of Natural Resources, a post that he has held since that time. Minister Carr has been a close and committed friend of Positive Energy, supporting our work very much from the outset. He is somebody who wants the best for energy decision-making in this country, and I cannot think of a more fitting individual to deliver keynote to open up our conference today. Please join me in welcoming Minister Carr.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I can't think of a better place to talk to you in than a place that's named after Huguette Laballe, a distinguished Canadian whom I got to know well. You know that she was chancellor of this great university, and you might know that she also, for 6 or 7 years, headed up a major international institution, CITE. You might not know that she was on the board of directors of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and that's where we met. And that's where I learned from her and from other members of that wonderful institute, headquartered, by the way, in my home city of Winnipeg, that the conversation of resource development and environmental protection is one conversation, and the work that she did with us at IASD, at CITE, and at this university is the reason that someone had the good sense to name a room after her, and I'm just honored to be able to speak to you in her room. And thank you, Monica. You did a whoopee when I was elected. I had no idea what was going on in my life, I can tell you. There are two things for which there is absolutely no preparation in life and no manual. One is parenthood, and the other is being a minister. People can tell you what it's like, Their kids weren't the same, but you might want to follow this strategy or another, and then friends in the cabinet will tell you should expect a heavy workload, but nothing can prepare you for the reality of it. And I also remember some serious conversations that you and I have had over the years about energy development in Canada, and the wisdom and the balance that you bring in such perfect bilingualism is something that I cherish. And thank you for the invitation to spend a few minutes with you. And also to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. That's significant for a couple of reasons. First, such acknowledgements remind us that this nation's first people were also this land's first protectors. And an Indigenous proverb says, "We do not inherit this land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." And I would say we do both, because we have an obligation from those who came before 7 generations to leave this land and our relationship with the land, the air, and the water better than we found it for the 7 generations that follow. And also the Algonquin connection reminds us of our earliest roots as a trading nation. The city of Ottawa takes its name from the Algonquin word for trade, a nod to the days when the nearby shores of the Ottawa River were a place for Indigenous people to meet and to barter. All of this goes to the heart of our government's own vision for Canada in this clean growth century, a vision built on economic prosperity, environmental protection, and Indigenous partnerships. And this great country is well positioned to realize that vision and to lead the global transition to a low-carbon economy with our abundance of natural resources, our experience and know-how in developing them, and our history as free traders. But first, we have to restore public confidence. And that's why I opened by saying this conference is both important and timely. Public confidence in energy decision-making is not just a well-chosen theme or a compelling research project. It's critical to our future, rallying Canadians in common cause and in shared purpose. Unfortunately, as Monica's opinion research has found, Canadians' confidence in the country's energy system has slipped. There are still those who think we have to sacrifice the economy to protect the environment, or vice versa. We set about to show Canadians that the economy and the environment are mutually reinforcing objectives. Less than 3 months into our mandate, we introduced an interim set of principles for reviewing major resource projects, an approach aimed at maintaining investor certainty, expanding public consultations, and enhancing Indigenous engagement. And next, we went to work with the provinces and territories and in consultation with Indigenous peoples to develop a national plan that drives economic growth as we combat a changing climate. The Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change is that plan, an ambitious blueprint to create good jobs and meet our international commitments in the Paris Agreement. In lockstep with that, we also announced the single largest investment in Canada's history to protect our oceans, the Ocean Protection Plan, a $1.5 billion investment that protects our coasts, makes navigation safer, and strengthens our capacity to respond in the unlikely event of an oil spill. And we didn't stop there. We launched Generation Energy, Canada's largest national discussion on energy in our nation's history. We invited Canadians to imagine our energy future, and they responded by the hundreds of thousands. 380,000 people took the time to offer an opinion to us on what Canada's energy mix should look like in a generation. 350,000 Canadians and 30,000 people from around the world. And hundreds traveled to my home city of Winnipeg for a 2-day Generation Energy Forum last fall. Monica was there as our MC. She saw it, she heard it. Suddenly, People who may never have spoken to each other before were now in the same room, challenging each other and themselves. And at the end of the 2 days, when I delivered some sum-up remarks, I asked people in the audience to put up their hands if they had experienced any moment of discomfort during the last 2 days. Every single hand in the room went up. Everybody was uncomfortable at one stage or another. And I said, what a good thing that is. If we're all in our comfort zone, we are not learning. And we are not understanding that we have to move together. In spite of the different places where we may start the journey, we believe there's a consensus on where we're wanting to go together. Years from now, Canadians may well look back and say that Generation Energy was a turning point, that it marked our emergence as a clean growth leader. We're now taking that optimism to create a Canadian energy strategy. Many of you in this room probably have some idea of how it began. David Runnels knows, because he was the president of IISD. I was president of the Business Council of Manitoba, and Roger Gibbons was president of the Canada West Foundation, and we all sat on each other's boards. And after we witnessed President Obama come to Ottawa and ask President Harper to engage in a continental dialogue about clean energy, we kind of scratched our heads simultaneously and said, well, what's the Canadian energy strategy that we will take to have a conversation with the American president? And the answer was, we didn't have a Canadian energy strategy. So we made some phone calls, and 9 CEOs of the leading think tanks in Canada came to, guess where? Winnipeg, at the corner of Portage and Main. I'll save Go Jets Go for the end. And we were able to crank out something called the Winnipeg Consensus that in itself became the Canadian energy strategy that was championed by the premiers through the Council of the Federation. An interesting study, by the way, for academics in the room on how public policy can be developed outside of government. And now government's embracing what we believe to be a common objective for the country. So what were some of the things that have been done lately? Well, and what are those things that we think will be a part of where we move from here? Leveraging the fossil fuel resources we have today to deliver clean energy solutions for tomorrow. Advancing shared priorities to use more renewables and promote energy efficiency. Linking those provinces who have an abundance of clean electricity with those who are trying to get there. All of these things I've just talked about are captured in the spirit of Bill C-69, which strengthens the way environmental assessments and regulatory reviews are carried out, with better rules to restore public trust, advance Indigenous reconciliation, protect our environment, and encourage new investments. I know that some of you in the room aren't thrilled with all of those clauses in our legislation, but you also know that our minds have been open and that we're always looking at ways to make the bill stronger, understanding that the objective within the bill is to make it clearer and more predictable for investors and to have a thorough impact assessment made to do what we want to do always, and that is to create good jobs, allow good projects to go through while protecting our environment. A new approach that starts really with some key changes. First, we are establishing
Okay. Thank you. I know. I just have one little thing to say, and I thank you for inviting me in. Yep, I appreciate that. Buju bidno nimki kwa dijinakaz kikunang donjaba Anishinaabe kwa nindao majika odem. So, if you need a translation, my name is Early Morning Thunder Woman. I'm from the Kettle and Stony Point First Nation in Ontario. I'm a Turtle Clan, and I'm Anishinaabe from Ontario. And I have been in several energy meetings. I've been in several rooms talking about bitumen, about pipelines. I have a friend that is in Peace River, blocking the dam that is going through their traditional territories. I have friends that are still standing at the Oglala Nations, trying to prevent work from being done in our sacred sites. This is Turtle Island. This is an Anishinaabe nation. You don't actually have any authority to do any of the work that you're doing. And by the duty to consult of the Crown as the rightful heir to the Crown, I feel like you don't have any right to be on any of our lands. You can check my lineage, Samantha Elijah, as a heir to Jesus Christ. I think I have the authority to block any more work from being done in our lands. So if you want to follow me to, let's go to Supreme Court, I can prove that all the work that you're doing in our lands are illegal and should be ceased immediately. And I hope that there's a press conference following this, because I can back up the research that I've done on my lineage as the rightful heir to the Crown. That means that you have the duty to consult with me. And I feel like that is enough authority in any Canadian government to deal with. Thank you. I have paperwork. If anybody wants to see me, I'll be over there. So you guys, I'll be seeing you in court, and you won't be having any more of your developments in any of our territories any longer. Miigwech.
Thank you. So, are we feeling uncomfortable yet? This is precisely the reason that positive energy exists. Clearly, we are facing some very substantial challenges in this country around different ways of thinking about energy, different ways of thinking about how we make decisions when it comes to energy projects. This is what we're here for. This is what we've been trying to do and work on for the last 3 years. So we would like to thank those who just expressed their opinions, thank them for doing so in a peaceful, respectful fashion. I would like to give the minister an opportunity if he has some remarks he'd like to make in response to that. And then we also would like to take a few questions. I know the minister has to get back to the House for a vote, but all of you here in this room may have some questions that you want to ask of the minister, and he has graciously agreed to respond to questions. Minister.
In 1906, all 4 of my grandparents came to Canada. They were escaping the pogroms of the Tsar. They couldn't be who they were. The thought that they could arrive at a public meeting, like this one, and take a microphone and explain to the people who were in the room how they had suffered through racism, through humiliation, through the horrible indignities of being a religious minority. That's why they came to Canada. And the fact that we are in this room at a university and we understand the power of the freedom of speech And the power of the sharing of experiences one to the other is the reason that Canada is such a great country. I would have finished my speech talking about Bill C-69. I would have spoken about the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. I would have talked about the historic consultation with Indigenous peoples. I would have talked about how important it is to protect the land, the air, and the water. And I would have closed with a sense of optimism about where our country is and where it can be. This conversation about the future of our energy mix is not something that is a Canadian chat. It's all over the world. Wherever we go, whether it's in Europe or Latin America or in Asia, the conversation is about the transition to a low-carbon economy and ways in which nation states are choosing to get there, with the trajectory and the pace absolutely unknown. And people look to Canada and they see in us a model nation to lead because of the abundance of resources we have, because of our capacity to innovate, because of the power of our entrepreneurship, because of our political system and its stability, because we live under the rule of law, and because how we include all of our people in the decisions we make. So I will end on that optimistic note and be happy to take any of your questions. I'd be glad to take your questions if you have a few.
My question, coming from Ottawa First Nation, where we have the first diamond mine in Ontario, Chisasibi First Nation, where you have used our water resource. We have much difficulties on our lands because of the raping of Mother Earth. And you have left us to clean up your mess. Ninan noachamagonak, ninan joashamishak, gahosichik. It is my children, it is my relatives that have been left with much illness, such as cancer, from the contamination. And there is never a holistic cleanup, not physically, not mentally, not emotionally, and not spiritually. And you have a sign up there that says positive energy, and I understand it a different way. Back there, you're serving alcohol. We understand the alcohol as a spirit, an alcohol spirit. So we have already started off with on the wrong foot. And you're here on our lands. Many of your people's spirit is in the bottle, the alcohol spirit. So it's not happening in a good way. Positive energy needs to come from a clear mind. So how are you going to address the contamination to Ogawi Mawaski? Minister Carr?
Minister? I see another question coming forward. If you could identify yourself, please.
Good evening. My name is Jacob Irving. I'm the president of the Energy Council of Canada. I wanted to ask, you, in a world that is often marked by energy poverty, people, countries around the world who don't have enough energy, who do not have an abundance of choices, who look to Canada to help solve their energy problems, how can we do a better job of translating that message back to Canadians when we look at our own choices? How come in Canada the conversation of global energy poverty isn't higher up on the agenda than we see?
Because we don't talk about it enough. At international energy meetings for the last number of months, and there will be more coming up now, I'm encouraging the International Energy Agency to talk about a global energy strategy. We've talked about a Canadian strategy and a continental one. And in my conversations with Secretary Perry and Secretary Joaquin Coldwell, we talk about the importance of establishing a regional bloc in North America. But a global energy strategy will give credit and take into account how one nation is helping the developing world get off GHG production that is very harmful to their communities and their society. So this is ambitious. It's challenging enough within any nation state to agree on an energy strategy for that state. So to do it internationally is that much more complex. But I think it's inevitable and it's important because as we commit ourselves as Canadians through the Paris Agreement and through other ways to contributing to an international effort, I think we also have to be acknowledged in Canada when we establish a set of policies and a set of trading relationships and the establishment of global routes where we are contributing to the energy policies of other countries in a way that's positive for the world. So I agree with the premise of your question. In our own way, we're advancing those values, and I'm glad you gave me a chance to say so.
The minister has to head out, so I'm terribly sorry. There are a few more questions here. We would have loved to get to them, but I'm being told that you have a vote to return to at the House. Thank you so much, Minister, for some thought-provoking remarks, and I'd like to invite everybody to join me in thanking you for your time here with us today. I'd now like to invite to the stage the distinguished participants that we have with us this evening to participate in an Energy Leaders armchair discussion. So I'll call each of your names if you can come up to the stage. I've got a few opening remarks and then we'll get into the discussion. So Nick Nanos, Chair and CEO of Nanos Research. Kim Baird, Senior Advisor, Hill & Knowlton Strategies. Bruce Cameron, former Executive Director of the Nova Scotia Department of Energy. Louis Legault, Chair of CAMPUT, Canada's Energy and Utility Regulators. David Runnels, Board President of the Pembina Institute. And Doug Settles, the Chief Executive Officer of Encana. Now, you'll find bios for each of the participants in the back of your program. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read them out here today, but I invite you to consult them. We have a tremendous lineup of speakers. So in a way, this Energy Leaders discussion, for me, is like Back to the Future. And the reason that I say that is that when we organized the inaugural conference for positive energy, we held an armchair discussion, very similar to the one we're about to have right now. And in fact, a number of the people on this panel were participants at that inaugural conference. Bruce, Nick, David, and Encana. Now there are a few new friends that we've made along the way. Louis Legault, who's up here as well, and Kim, who's attending her first positive energy event. So I'm really looking forward to this session. The armchair discussion is really going to help us set the stage for the remainder of the event. This is a broad-based discussion of the issues around public confidence. In essence, what have we accomplished in Canada and at Positive Energy over the last 3 years, and what still remains to be done. The following day's sessions will get into the weeds on particular aspects of public confidence, but for now, this is a much higher level discussion. I wanted to give you, before we get started, a brief overview of accomplishments at Positive Energy. We think over the last 3 years that we've influenced things. We've been told that we've influenced things. We've been in and we've organized the right people in the right rooms talking about the right things for the last 3 years now. I think we've contributed on the following fronts. Diagnosing the problem. Why is it that we're facing this challenge when it comes to public confidence in energy decision making? Some of you will remember a report that Mike Cleland and I co-authored that was released about a year ago that laid out an animal metaphor of elephants, horses, and sitting ducks. That was our diagnosis of one of the reasons why we're facing some of these key challenges when it comes to public confidence. The horses in this metaphor are horses that have left the barn. Social and value change in the post-war period. We see far lower levels of trust in government, in industry, in the media. People are less deferent to decisions of public authorities. We see people want to be involved in decisions that affect them, the democratization of decision making. And we're seeing increasingly people's line of sight focused on the individual level over the group interests. We're also seeing, as we know all too well, the rise of social media and the permanent changes that that is having on our information and communications environment. The elephants in this animal metaphor are elephants. We talk about them in the report, Mike and I, many elephants in many rooms. And what we're referring to there is policy gaps. That policy gaps on big issues like climate, like reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and cumulative effects management for the effects of multiple projects, that we've seen these spilling over into the energy decision-making processes for individual projects, all of which are ill-equipped to try to address any of those broader public policy issues on their own. And then finally, the sitting ducks. Who are the sitting ducks in this animal metaphor? Well, they're energy decision-making processes themselves. Policy institutions, regulatory institutions, individual energy regulators, and the like. But we've done more than just diagnose the problem. I can recall one of the government participants in Positive Energy saying, you know, you academics, you just fall in love with problems, but you don't actually work on solving them. Well, one of the things that we've tried to do at Positive Energy is to undertake research and engagement to actually solve these issues. What's to be done about it? Positive Energy has stressed the need for a multi-pronged approach based on what we call informed reform with a long view in mind. And what do we mean by informed reform? Looking at not only intended consequences of reforms to energy decision-making systems, but also unintended consequences. Governments need to move on those policy gaps. We've often talked at Positive Energy about regulatory reform being a necessary but insufficient condition to strengthening public confidence in energy decision-making. But yes, regulation itself needs to be strengthened, needs to be more flexible, there needs to be more opportunities for engagement, more interaction with policymakers, all the while respecting regulatory independence. And then governments need to work on, with others, resolving stresses in energy decision-making. Who decides on energy projects, on energy policy, on regulatory development? How do we make those decisions? With what levels of engagement? With what capacity? With what actors? And how do we strengthen the relationship between policymakers and regulators? So it's clear who's deciding on what issues with what scope of authority. All of this to say that the key influence of Positive Energy over the last 3 years has really been about the recognition that the public confidence challenge is a systems challenge. We need to look at the entire energy decision-making system, not just one part. And we've been active at Positive Energy across the entire energy decision-making system. At the policy level, we've engaged directly with the Energy and Mines Ministers Conference. As the Minister just said, we've been front and center with Natural Resources Canada's Generation Energy Initiative. We've been active with provincial policymakers and in front of parliamentary committees. At the regulatory level, we've been actively engaged with the National Energy Board modernization process, with Canada's energy regulators across the country through CAMPUT, and also with individual regulators at both the federal and the provincial levels. At the project decision-making level, we've undertaken cutting-edge research with the Canada West Foundation on what drives local communities' levels of satisfaction and dissatisfaction with energy project decision-making processes. All along the way, we've fed into key reform processes, key events, and key moments, and it continued to lead a neutral, nonpartisan forum for resolution of the issues. You can see the imprints of our research and engagement across the country, and for that, we are very grateful. But we're not so naive as to think that we're the only ones who've influenced decisions, nor are we so naive as to think that all is well on the public confidence front. The latest controversy over the Trans Mountain pipeline is a case in point that we still have a long way to go on some really fundamental questions. Who decides when it comes to energy projects? Regulators? Governments? At which levels? Communities? Which communities? And how? How do we make decisions when it comes to energy projects? Through independent regulatory processes, political agreements, some combination of the two? And how do we get to decision-making arrangements that are durable? How will we know when we've got there? Positive Energy has proposed answers to these questions. You will hear about them tomorrow, and they're synthesized in the Durable Balance report that you received as you came in this afternoon. For now, though, what I'd like to do is turn to our distinguished panelists for their perspectives. Each panelist will give opening remarks of between 3 and 5 minutes, focused on their views of what has been accomplished in Canada and what remains to be done. We will then proceed to a moderated discussion and questions from the audience. But before we do that, we have a minor issue which needs to be dealt with, which is getting rid of the podium here so you can all see our distinguished panelists, because they're all going to be speaking from their chairs. So I'd like to call up whoever the muscle is that's going to be moving the podium. Thank you very much.
Oh, we were planning on hiding behind it.
Not allowed, not allowed. All right, so let's get started. We have agreed previously that Nick will be the first to speak, and one of the reasons Nick will be the first to speak is because Nick has to leave at 6:30. So unfortunately, we'll be losing Nick a little bit of the ways through our session. But Nick, I mean, you've been working with us. We have a great relationship with Nanos Research, a great partnership. We've done some terrific work together. What's your sense of how we're doing, what remains to be done?
You know, it's interesting. If we were, I know we have 3 minutes, so how about if I summarize my presentation in 4 words? We can do better is probably the single message that we receive from Canadians. I guess my role in this process was to engage and bring at least the voice of Canadians to the table. And it's a great project to work on because you have the intersection of thought leaders like you, Monica, and Michael. You know, you have policy thinkers, you have academia, private sector, everyone coming to the table focused on this kind of single issue. And you know, what's interesting, in the survey that we did just earlier this month, and we're still crunching the numbers, I find it interesting on a number of levels. You know, first of all, what's very clear from the research is that Canadians are very engaged, right? When they hear something in the news about energy issues, whether it's in their neighborhood, whether it's in their province or in other parts of the country, they're engaged. And the other thing, if there was a key takeaway, is that they're very pragmatic. That's kind of one of the other themes that kind of came through in the research. So, you know, when we look at the numbers and ask Canadians how interested or disinterested they are in kind of energy issues, about 7 out of every 10 Canadians say they're outright interested. But, you know, the kicker here is that although 7 out of 10 are interested in kind of energy policy issues and dialogue related to that, only about 1 every 4 actually think that they're informed, which means that there's a fundamental gap out there, right? It's kind of like people know that energy issues are important. They're interested in energy issues and dialogue related to that, but they don't have information. Maybe it's in this this Trump-like world of fake news and fake information, that they have a lot of things coming at them, and they're kind of unsure in terms of what they can trust and what they shouldn't trust. The other thing that came through, and it's very interesting considering all the stuff in the news lately related to Trans Mountain, is that a significant majority of Canadians expect federal leadership on this issue. That yes, communities play an important role. Stakeholders and Indigenous peoples play a very important role. Provinces play an important role. But that there's an expectation that the federal government exercise its convening power to bring people together to find solutions that are in everybody's best interest. And you know, the other thing is that when we look at trade-offs, jobs, projects, prosperity, and things like that, it's interesting from a polling perspective that there seems to be a hierarchy. And I say this with respect to all the stakeholders at the table, ranging from local communities to Indigenous peoples and so forth. But when we think, when we ask Canadians about the respective trade-offs, right? The rights and interests of Indigenous peoples compared to the national interest. The rights and interests of local communities when it comes to the national interest. And also trade-offs when it comes to our environmental aspirations. It's pretty clear from the research that at the top of the list is our economic aspirations, that we're probably willing to put a little more water in our wine, so to speak, and I know that's a very inappropriate comment considering the protest that was just made, that would interest in putting a little water in their wine, so to speak, when it comes to trying to achieve our aspirations related to prosperity and the environment. The good news is that even though Canadians say that we can do better, they believe that we're creative enough to find solutions, positive solutions that can reconcile our energy reality in terms of what we need to have prosperity in the future, and at the same time, our environmental aspirations. So with that, I'll kind of pass it on to my fellow panelists.
Terrific. Thanks, Nick. That's something that struck me as well. Notably, this latest round of research that's the most extensive that we've undertaken, and we're going to have an additional presentation about that research tomorrow morning. Unfortunately, you're not available, but a member of our research team is going to do that, and all of those polling results will be made available publicly tomorrow as well. But I think that was one of the things that struck me too, was the extent to which, if you, just listening to the media and the political controversy, one would have the impression that issues around energy are far more polarized in the country than Canadians, in the public opinion research that we've done, are really demonstrating. I find that a fascinating disconnect, and I'd be interested in exploring that when we get to the discussion session. For now, though, and we'll come, you're right towards me. So, Kim, you're a former chief. You've done a tremendous amount of work with your community on these issues. You've also been involved in federal processes around energy decision making. What's your perspective? What have we done well? What do we still need to accomplish?
Thanks, Monica, and to everyone for inviting me to participate this evening, all the way from the West Coast, where there are some heated discussions underway about energy projects. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here on unceded Algonquin territory and thank the Algonquin people for letting me access their beautiful territory. My name is Kim Barrett. My ancestral name is Quintiltanot, which comes from my great-great-grandfather at Tsawwassen First Nation. We're a Coast Salish people living at the mouth of the Fraser River, south of Vancouver. For my business, I currently consult with Indigenous groups, primarily First Nations, industry and government on Indigenous matters. I'm an associate with Hill & Knowlton and have my own consultancy practice and sit on various boards, including the newly formed Infrastructure Bank of Canada and the Public Policy Forum and Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. I have experience as a former chief of my community where I led the negotiation and implementation of a modern land claim agreement and self-governance for my community. I spent 6 years on the BC Hydro Board, so I've done a fair bit of work in the liquid natural gas industry as well. And I have a unique experience when it comes to my view of major energy projects, whether it's because I've opposed some of them on behalf of my community, or I've helped advance them, as in the case of BC Hydro. And although British Columbia is unique in relation to issues of Aboriginal rights and title, I believe other regions of the country will see increased legal uncertainty about major energy projects unless Aboriginal rights and other Indigenous rights are resolved. And by resolving them, I think involvement in design, implementation, and benefits of major projects will be a part of those solutions. And while many changes are underway, as the program says, in relation to the regulatory processes in this country, some of the controversial projects that are advancing, such as the TMX, haven't benefited from these new projects, yet they're still on the books, so to speak. I chaired the Ministers' Panel on TMX after the National Energy Board decision, so I had a first-hand look at many of the issues and concerns members of the public and First Nations raised about the project, but also about broader concerns pertaining to public policy and processes. A lot has happened since then, so in my opinion, things are heading in a better trajectory from an Indigenous lens. I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but there's still a far way to go. And so those are my opening thoughts, and I look forward to the discussion tonight.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Kim. That's really thought-provoking. Bruce, you're a former do I say recovering policymaker? What's the term of our?
I'm not recovering at all.
I think you're good to go. Just
yeah. Am I on? Yeah,
yep.
I am. So I'm hardly recovering at all. What I want to bring is a little bit of a perspective here for two of my careers. One was 20 years as a journalist, and then 20 years as a policymaker within the government of Nova Scotia, primarily on energy. And almost everything came down to a question of risk and reward. So wherever there was dissent, concern, it really was a misalignment and a feeling that there was too much risk and very little reward for whatever the issue that was on the table. And until we can actually get to a balance where people are comfortable that there is a balance between risk and reward, there's going to be that clash. The other part of it is that it can't be on every single issue. It has to be a little bit more general in the sense that it's not every project. There has to be a sense that on balance, on a larger sense, that we're getting to more good than bad, and there's not a risk that's unacceptable. We've got that balance. And in order to get there, we really need to have the other part of an equation that comes with public confidence, which is about trust. Because you can't have a sense that I'm going to get the rewards unless you trust that the system will deliver it, or that by and large that's going to come. And the language that we've had too often in the public debates has been, you can't trust anybody, it's too negative. And quite frankly, in my generation, the saying was that you can't trust anybody over 30. So, you know, this is not a new concept, that trust doesn't come easily. And I really want to say that trust comes also from a sense of knowing and getting factual information. And today that becomes a very difficult part of our world in order to know who do you trust for your information. And my non-recovering policy world, that's what I'm focusing on a lot these days, is about energy data and energy information and trying to be helpful about that. So when you come to a question of trust, then it's partly how do you build it? Well, it's step by step, it's proof of good intentions. Trust doesn't come overnight. You don't immediately decide to trust everybody. And in fact, it's important to think about trust as a long-term exercise. And the impediments are actually all about fear. It's easier to build distrust than it is to build trust. There's a virus out there. It's in the social media, and everything that's bad is more quickly spread than everything that's good. We know all of that. One of the little examples that I want to talk about, though, about building trust as part of respect, was in Nova Scotia. We spent a lot of time working with First Nations groups about helping them to reach their aspirations when it came to energy. And a lot of it was about renewable energy. And we designed programs, supported them, helped them develop their own strategies and plans so that they could participate in the energy future of Nova Scotia. And interestingly enough, one of the flashpoints of where there was a community clash between the developer was actually on a First Nations project. And it was the First Nations who were then put in the position of having to explain to the local community that they would do their very best to try and find alternatives. They would do things differently if they could, but at the end of the day, if they couldn't, they would have to proceed respectfully. And you know, I spoke to the person who was the leader in that development, and he told me that they had a very respectful conversation with people, and they couldn't do anything different. But at the end of the day, the local people accepted that they had tried. And so I think that it's important for us to build in that kind of culture of respect and to find stakeholders and people that can come with us on making those sorts of decisions. And I just want to close on the issue of credibility. Climate change is really what you would call an existential policy issue. It's just so overwhelming and all-encompassing. It's very difficult to try and get down to a level of concrete things because it's so big and so large. And really, one of our difficulties, I think, is that the way that climate change has been portrayed recently, there's been an undue focus on the price of carbon. And it's really been about, you know, our solution is going to be putting a price of carbon and this is going to solve the problems. That's not what governments are doing in total. They're doing a lot of other things, but that's the focus. And in fact, some of our best wins have been about performance standards. And performance standards in some ways has more credibility than a general, if I make it really expensive, you're not going to want it anymore and you'll do something different. As opposed to, say, in the fuel standards that we have for automobiles, a big debate in the United States right now, it's part of Canada. But it has made a tangible difference when you have, with law and regulation, you must achieve this. And I'll close on the observation that in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, two provinces that said you shall have a reduction of GHG emissions are the two provinces that have actually met and exceeded their goals on GHG reductions. So it's credible, it's got tangible results, and we've got to have more of the conversations about how to do that, because that's the only way we're going to be credible.
Lots in there, Bruce. Thanks, especially on the process side and looking at what are some of the key policy tools. Have we been focusing in on some, maybe to the exclusion of others? So, Louis, you don't get the opportunity to be a recovering regulator because you still are a regulator and chair of CAMPUT, so you represent, in some ways, all of Canada's energy regulators. What's your perspective on these issues?
It's not simple, Monica, and Nick said it in the opening. You know, we can do better. We have to do better. My worry as a regulator is the how and the who, and there's no clear paths to that. As a regulator, there are different kinds of regulation. Technical regulation, you know, the wideness of a road, or the safety standards. There's all kinds of regulation. I represent a group of utility regulators. We're essentially economic regulators. We set rates and conditions for the sale of electricity and gas and whatever, and water in certain circumstances. And we are recognized as being experts in what we do and making decisions based on hard, proven facts, scientific, factual evidence. Our legislation in Quebec, I work for the Quebec Energy Board, essentially states in its opening section of the law, of the statute, that we're a balancing act between the interest of consumers and the interest of industry, and we have to make sure that the public interest is taken into account when we make these decisions. Recently, about a year and a half ago, our legislation was modified to now bring into focus the necessity or the possibility to do public consultation, to consult and inform public on the cases and the hearings that we have, and we do that prior to hearings. Naturally, as an attorney, I have my own set of reservations. How do we deal with that? How do we take into account this information when we make rulings? Is it evidence? Is it just coloring the process? It's not clear. But more on a philosophical approach to this. As a regulator, I'm wondering, who is the person responsible to consult the public? Who should be informed by the public information? Is it the regulator? I'm not sure, and I'm questioning this approach. Our governments, the policymakers, isn't their job to do this? Are they passing the bucket to the regulators in light of this new concept of social licensing? We want to go ahead with this, so we want to make sure that the people agree. We're going to ask the regulator to consult the population. Is it really the regulator's job? Is the regulator well or ill-equipped to do this? I'm wondering. I don't have the answers. I'm just wondering, and these are issues that we have not yet settled. Is the regulator being polluted? Will its independence as a body be challenged if the regulator starts doing the work of the policymaker? And I'm worried about that, and I think most Canadian regulators are worried about this. So, food for thought.
Great. Thanks, Louis. David, you've been in the trenches on issues of climate, the environment, and sustainable development. You've seen a lot domestically and internationally. How do you think we're doing? What still needs to be done?
I was thinking about this on the way over. I guess if I was going to write a book about Canadian policy, Canadian climate policy, I'd call it From Hero to Zero to question mark. Brian Mulroney got this and actually was a major figure in getting climate change on the international agenda. But there then was a hiatus of a number of years in which we consistently overpromised and underdelivered, and underdelivered in a major way. And I've been arguing for years that if you do that and you're a smaller country and a medium-sized power, sooner or later you'll get to the stage where your climate policy will be determined by somebody else, by the international community. And that's essentially what happened in 2009 when Prime Minister Harper agreed to the 2030 targets with no plan to do anything about them and no real advice as to how Canada would actually operate. So into that moved, and you all know this, into that vacuum moved the provinces with some varied success. And the current government has done its best to try and stitch that together and make it look like a national scheme. The Paris conference was, I think, semi-miraculous. I don't think most of us expected much would happen. And the Canadian performance was most unusual. You had the Prime Minister and virtually every Premier all standing on the stage, holding hands and dancing together. I've never seen anything like that before. And so out of that came the Pan-Canadian climate framework. Now, we'll see what happens, and we'll see how long public trust lasts in the political process. We have 3 of the major provinces about to have elections. It's quite likely that all 3 of those governments will go and will be replaced by people, not in Quebec, but in Alberta and Ontario, who have no interest in this as an issue, and we'll see ourselves fighting elections on the famous job-killing carbon tax, of which there's no evidence. And I'm afraid that what's happening now is we're doing what's happening in the United States, which is politicizing an issue which shouldn't be politicized in the way it is. Climate science is clear. The issue is with us. It's worsening. There will be increased international pressure, Donald Trump notwithstanding, to ratchet up the targets agreed in Paris. That's what the agreement actually calls for. And Canada will find itself, I think, in a much more difficult position. And my guess is if we get this sort of constant succession of governments in which the Ontario government comes in and constructs a very elaborate cap and trade system, for example, and Mr. Ford comes in and demolishes it and tries to replace it with something else, I wonder what kind of public trust we're going to get in the political system when it deals with climate as an issue. And maybe Mr. Ford and Mr. Kenney will be much more pragmatic than they have indicated so far. But so far, it's going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight, and climate change, I think, will be, if not the major issue, one of the 2 or 3 major issues in each of those provinces. And I'm not necessarily going to defend the current government, but I think if we flip-flop back and forth on an issue which is at minimum a 50, 60-year plan, or 60, 50-year issue, we're going to be in serious trouble, and we're going to get the politics dead wrong, and our political establishment will have real problems in establishing any credibility on this issue with the Canadian public. And all of Nick's surveys are showing that Canadians are genuinely concerned about this as an issue. If they begin to mistrust the capacity of policymakers to deal with it, it's going to make it much more difficult.
I think there's some really important points in there, David, notably around the potential for greater levels of polarization, not lower levels of polarization. So I'm looking forward to picking up on that. So, Doug, you're Chief Executive Officer of a major energy corporation with operations both here in Canada and in the United States, some really exciting new plays developing in the northeastern part of British Columbia. But you get an opportunity to see public confidence and project decision-making and energy systems in 2 very different jurisdictions. What's your perspective on how the country's doing here in Canada, what remains to be done?
Well, I think what's been fascinating that's happened with energy over the last 10 or 15 years is how it's moved from the shadows to the forefront. And throughout my career, I've had a chance to work all over the world and be in not only developed nations, but developing nations. And the difficult part of this conversation is it's very different in developed countries than developing countries. Demand for energy is growing as fast as it's ever grown at any time in history. Demand for oil and gas is at the highest levels of all time and still growing quite rapidly. Yet if you sit in Canada or the United States or Europe, you actually find those same trends are not happening here. Demand for energy is relatively flat. The demand for oil and natural gas is flat or dropping. So where is this demand coming from? And it's actually coming from about the 2.5 billion people around the world who are trying to move out of poverty. They're trying to move into middle class. And this is a very different issue for them than it is here. And I think this is one of the things that's challenging about it. Particularly in Canada, we're an exporting nation. We're a supplier of energy to others today. But what we find is, and it comes down to some of the comments earlier, is it is very local. So if you're in a place where people don't have electricity to power a light bulb or to refrigerate food or to cook their dinner in the evening, what they're expecting and the issues that are most important to them are very different than you live in a modern society with the comforts we all enjoy here. So I think when we find in our business, both in Canada and the United States, we're actually in an age of abundance of energy today. We're seeing that. There's a famous geologist in the industry, goes back to the 30s, named Wallace Pratt, who had a great saying. He said, oil and gas isn't found in the ground, it's found in the minds of men and women. I think he said men at the time, but we'll modernize the statement a little bit. And it's absolutely true. As the demand grows, the industry tries to find it. But what's happened is, and we've seen it happen before, is the public's expectations move and change. If you look at modern cities today, when they transitioned off of coal to other forms of fuel, it was actually social needs that drove that. It was actually smog and pollution which drove those issues. And I think one of the things we've learned as an industry and we found very uncomfortable is we need to do more engagement. We need to do more information sharing. We actually preferred it when we could operate in the background and just make sure your lights came on, and if you went to the filling station, gasoline came out of the pump. But expectations are higher now than they ever have been. I think what's most challenging for our business, though, I think we know how to engage and communicate locally around the people who are directly impacted by our operations. We've got a long history of that. But now we find people thousands of miles away who want to be involved in those same discussions. And similar to the other panelists, we're finding it difficult. What's the best way to engage with those people? Because we don't interact with them every day like we do with the people who live right down the road from our operations.
Interesting. So I have loads of questions, but before actually moving into them, I thought it might be nice to give people on the panel an opportunity if they wanted to respond to anything that the other panelists have said, anything that sparked a comment for you or that you wanted to seek some clarification from of the other panelists. If not, I'm going to jump in. Go ahead, Nick.
If I could add, I think we have to remember the frame for everyone is that they don't trust anyone. They don't trust the government. They don't trust companies. They don't trust, and that's the fundamental frame that any project has to deal with. It's kind of like, think of it this way. If people don't trust democracy to help them just live and get ahead, why would they trust an energy project? And I think one of the challenges, I think, is, at least for the polling that we've done, is that people want a frank discussion on the trade-offs and also the risks, right? The economic trade-offs and also the environmental risks related to a project, and they want to hear about that. And I think, when those are dealt with directly, I think you're more likely to get people engaged in the process. But it's very difficult to do because if on the one hand, someone is a proponent for a project, your objective is to have your project move forward. But at the same time, I think the trick is to have balance in the dialogue in terms of the choices that people have, energy choices that people have and need, and also choices related to jobs and choices related to the environment.
Does anybody want in on that? Because if not, I wanted to take it somewhere. Yeah, David.
Well, I was just going to ask Nick in a way that if this becomes a polarizing issue, climate particularly becomes a highly partisan issue, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that as a society?
I think it comes down to, this goes back to, people have a default on a lot of these issues. I think what maybe we forget is that what we usually see in the news are usually not necessarily, at least from a Canadian public opinion perspective, the silent majority, who don't actually feel strongly about a lot of these projects. But they know when something isn't working right. So, I think, one of the things that needs to happen is just some sort of dialogue. And, one of these things, one of the challenge with carbon pricing, and, maybe this is unfair, policymakers will probably cringe when I say this, is that it's too complicated for an average person to understand. And when you don't understand something, it's hard to embrace something that you don't understand. And I think, so not only do we need to kind of engage in a dialogue and educate people, we have to kind of communicate in a way where they can understand and make choices in terms of whether they support a project or potentially oppose a project.
But I want to jump in on that because the question that David asked was I think really about climate and climate policy. Nick, your comments, at least initially, were about an energy project and people engaging in an energy project. One of the things that we've really found at Positive Energy is that you got to have the right forum to have the right conversation. And in many instances, what we're seeing is energy project decision-making processes, and I can imagine, Doug, you've experienced this on a few occasions, energy project decision-making processes are then utilized as the forum to talk about much broader questions of public policy, whether those are climate, reconciliation, cumulative effects management. So is there, in the Canadian context, I'll throw out a question for the group then, is part of what's missing to have that broader conversation? Yeah. Are we missing an energy vision?
How can you get anyone to buy into a project when they don't know how it fits into the future? How can you do that, right? You can't.
It's a great question.
No, you can't, because so if there's a project, there needs to be an explanation on how it fits into the future in terms of our aspirations for the economy, our aspirations related to the environment, our aspirations in terms of the types of communities we want to live in. And the thing is that many times if you can get people to buy into the destination, they're probably willing to accept some things that in isolation they might feel uncomfortable with. But you have to, and I think what we're lacking in Canada is an understanding of what that destination is. And I think that's where, we need the kind of convening power of kind of everyone to come together to say, okay, you know, maybe you don't like this, but here's how it fits into our long-term strategy for our country and how it fits into kind of our kind of engagement of communities and stakeholders and stuff like that.
Other thoughts on that? I mean, Nick, you're clearly putting down a marker there. We need an energy vision for the country. What do other folks think?
I think it's important that we all agree on the vision, or many people in this room would agree on the vision, the end point. But the point is the credibility of the waypoints along the way. And if you can't establish that there's progress, then there's the suspicion and distrust that says you're putting it out 50 years. Not all of us are going to be here in 50 years. And in any case, it's really about the fact that I don't see how you're going to be measured and accountable along that path. Therefore, I distrust the vision because I don't think you can achieve it. You haven't told me how you're going to get there.
So how do we get there?
Well, how do you have politicians who are geared towards a 4-year mandate to agree on a long-term vision? How do you, maybe that's a bigger question, right? Because structurally, our system is not built for, you know, why don't we just call it the way it is? Our system is not built for long-term planning because, you know, because governments change. How can communities make decisions? How can businesses make decisions when they're dealing in an uncertain political environment?
Well, I mean, this is where we're going to go with the next 3 years of positive energy is trust in energy transition decision-making processes, which by their very nature need to be long-term. David, I think I saw you wanting to jump in.
This is really a nightmare issue for politicians, and Nick has hit on it. It's not. It's what you're actually asking people to do is to inflict pain now in order to prevent something from happening in 3 or 4 elections' time. I can't imagine a less appetizing political cocktail to drink from. And there are countries that have done it, and it's interesting and instructive to ask why this is going much faster in Europe than it's done here, and where there is a much more ingrown belief that climate change is a huge challenge and they have to do something about it. And it also varies obviously across Canada, and much different in Quebec than it does in the rest of the country. But the political calculation for a guy like Jim Carr must be nightmarish. You wake up in the middle of the night wondering how you're actually going to sell this to your cabinet colleagues, let alone to the voters.
Doug, did you want to?
Well, I think the complexity here goes also that Canada, being a big energy producing nation, it makes it a much more complex issue. Some of the countries that have been out front on this are energy importers. And to some degree, they received economic benefit by more leveling the playing field. Where for politicians here, they're trying to balance all of these agendas, whether it's the concern about climate, the concern about jobs, the concern about government revenues. So it is quite complex. I think if I spoke from industry's perspective, though, when you make up policy on individual projects, it will result in fewer projects. It's a high degree of risk. What industry would prefer to do is see policy translated into regulation, and then we can make decisions if we believe we can achieve the requirements and the expectations in the regulation. And then capital will flow where it flows. That'll be the outcome of that. But today, I think what we find ourselves in Canada is as we're trying to wander through this space, policies being picked up on the next piece of business that's in front of us. And the net result of that is we're 4 years of declining investment, 2 years of declining exports in the country. And so I think, and that will ultimately show up in the polls. That will ultimately show up in the polls. So there does need to be a foundation established. And maybe the last point is the challenge with this issue as well is all the variables around it are not static. We've actually seen that in our industry. The shale revolution has moved the world from this energy scarcity to abundance. That people didn't see that coming 10 years ago, but now it's actually changed geopolitics. The cost of alternatives is coming down. That's shifting it too. The expectations about economic growth in developing nations is a big factor in this conversation. So it is very difficult to create a framework which recognizes these variables are going to change and shift over time as you move forward.
Kim, can I put you on the spot on some of this stuff? And we had a preparatory teleconference for this, and one of the things that you talked about in that session was, you know, when it comes to forward-looking issues, and I think you alluded to it in your remarks, that, you know, that we have sort of policy and political processes moving along. At the same time, we have projects kind of moving through former decision-making systems. And I think the word you used at that time was a roadmap. We're missing a roadmap for going forward. I recognize you can only bring an Indigenous perspective to this, but I'd love to hear you a little bit more on that if you could. What's missing?
Well, I think it's twofold from my perspective. You have Canada struggling with climate change and sorting out a vision for how to move forward on one stream, and the other stream is Canada struggling on how to resolve Indigenous rights in Canada as well. So it's compounding for First Nations trying to engage in this stuff, either through the regulatory process or other processes in advancing their issues. Many communities want to participate, but it's super challenging when all the rules are constantly changing and there is no roadmap and there is no sense of whether engagement is actually going to meet your community's needs as well. So I think as Canada is sorting out its longer term institutions and policies and processes as an evolving young country, it still has to sort out how it engages with Indigenous people at the same time.
And again, not to put you on the spot, but I think I'm going to. Are there particular ideas or steps or mechanisms that you would see, because we're trying in as much as we can at this conference to identify some, you know, kind of concrete action items. Are there particular steps you would see as being useful in that process, whether it's roles that governments or others could play?
Well, there's many successes across the country. They aren't entrenched in laws or policies, but you know, the basis is from collaboration, whether it be between industry, government, and First Nations is more my background. There's agreements reached every day. So I think there's lots to learn from those spots in the country that are succeeding.
Okay. Terrific. So we've got some time here for questions. We'd like to open it up to people if they have a question for folks in the armchair discussion. If not, I'll just keep firing questions at them. Oh, I see we have a taker. If you could identify yourself, Chris, that would be great.
Thanks, Monica. My name's Chris with Limbus Energy. I mean, before Nick left, I really liked his remarks and also with David's. To me, one of the issues, the question of the panel is credibility here. And I think from the narrative of a project like what's happening with Kinder Morgan or other projects that may be renewable and non-renewable, you have to look at things that have happened recently that have led to the public assuming there isn't credibility with any project, let alone not having a roadmap. I'll just point to a couple. When you decide to, and they both were consequences on Indigenous, economic, and environment. So let's look at Muskrat Falls and let's look at Site C. So here there were major projects driven through largely by governments, in the participation sometimes with utilities. The homework was not done in both cases of what the economic impacts would be. In the case of the environment, they had impacts. In the case of the Indigenous, they had impact. So what you have is a situation when you're trying to engender confidence, you both need a vision as I would say more a vision, more a roadmap, like the language you were using to go forward, but you also have to appreciate that the credibility has been eroded. So what we have to do is to talk where the credibility has been positive. And that's where we have done things right. But you've got some projects out there that really, frankly, don't look very good. And they've been very public, and there's no, the trust level, the real trust challenge with the trust here is that we've eroded most of the trust that Canadians would give to these projects. And I think that's a really sobering situation for where we're at. So the question of the panel is, in light of that reality, what's the one or two things that start to begin to build trust? Because it's a pretty big uphill road.
Thoughts?
Well, you know, one of the things that I've experienced over the course of my career is it's uncomfortable, but you have to start with prepared to being engaged in the conversations. And you know, I think it was stated earlier, a lot of times what we hear is the noise from the edges, but don't hear what the majority in the middle feel and see. So to do that, you actually have to go out and find them. You have to go out and engage directly with them. And that's why I still think one of the bigger challenges is not the local stakeholders, it's the wider ones, which is what is the mechanism to go do that? And how do we get past just the loud voices who have the strongest view to the majority and what their view is, and how do we bring that to the surface? Some of the survey data I was actually surprised by. I was surprised to see how most Canadians probably don't have as an extreme and as jaundiced a view as maybe has been portrayed even here today. That it seemed like we shouldn't take that for granted, but it sounded to me like they had a more balanced view, and this is one of many issues they're thinking about, but maybe not the strongest issue. So we shouldn't take that for granted. We should think about how we effectively communicate with them, how we embed their thoughts into the process as well as we go about shaping the direction for the future.
What else? Louis?
Well, going back to trust and in a way fate in the process, I think I'm part of a pretty good group of people. Regulators in Canada generally are respected. They are seen as transparent. They are seen as credible authorities that make decisions based on science and fact. Generally speaking, we all know about the NEB, and we all know about the panel for Energy East retiring because they had met with Jean Charest. That's nothing that's helpful in a situation to bring credibility to the regulator. But this being put aside, regulators are generally credible, but is it their job? Should we ask them to do the full length of the job to get the population to buy into projects, to buy into solutions? I'm not sure, and in fact, I don't even think so. I think regulators can be used, and when I talked about my own apprehensions as a lawyer for this public consultation, I read an article recently. It's allegations of bias in administrative law processes, and let me read just a little phrase.
Scintillating stuff, Louis. I'm just saying.
Just a little phrase. When a litigant has incorrect expectations regarding a particular aspect of adjudicative procedure or an inflated understanding of their own rights at a given point in the process, any conduct by an adjudicator that does not accord with those expectations is liable to give the litigant an apprehension of bias, thus mistrust. And essentially, I think it's the role of the regulators to go out there and inform the public of what the process is, how it works, and at least you may not agree with the final decision. You may not agree with the outcome, but if you trust the process and you trust that everybody's been given a fair chance to present their own positions and that all of the information has been taken into account, well, I think we have gone a long way towards bringing credibility to energy-making decisions.
Monica, if I can just add one thought to that. In order to build trust, you also have to have respect. And this evening, I think we had a respectful dialogue going on a tough subject in a way that made some people in the room uncomfortable. But it wasn't a lack of respect. And I think it worked, and it helped keep ears open. It doesn't help when you have language that's very vexatious and very, just meant to be explosive. If you have the head of a Crown corporation calling a project a boondoggle, then you're probably not building up that kind of a dialogue about what exactly the project's all about, where it might have gone wrong, and how it might be improved in the future. So it's respectful language and as respectful conversations are part of, far from the only, but it's part of trust.
Kim.
Trust is pretty straightforward from my perspective. It's having reliable information that you can count on. You know that it's not being sugar-coated by whatever side's advancing it. And I think that's a major problem these days. It's really hard to know where you can get information that you can trust. At least it is for me. From an Indigenous perspective, First Nations have really not built good, trusting relationship with governments for good reasons. I mean, all the policies that were created were meant to sort of step over Indigenous rights and title. And now you have people saying they want to start afoot with a new relationship, nation to nation, respect the UNDRIP sort of framework, new frameworks in Canada. But it comes down to doing what you commit to do and sort of following through on those things. And it's really quite simple. And if you can't, follow through on those commitments, you will never gain trust.
David.
Well, one of the things I think is also important is to actually tell some good stories about some things that have actually worked well. I did a reasonable amount of work a while ago with the mining industry, and I was quite struck by the fact that Canada has some of the worst practices and some of the best practices in the world when it comes, for example, to working with Aboriginal peoples. And the example of the diamond mines in the territories is a very good one. I mean, it works extremely well. The whole concept of co-management was essentially invented in Canada. It's now being used for many of the national parks in the north. It's being used for the big park up near Churchill in Manitoba. These things actually work quite well, and there are plenty of people from the Aboriginal side that are prepared to say, yes, we're part of this process, and we think it works well as well. A good deal of the Plan Nord in Quebec is like that as well. So, I think there is some quite good experience in Canada. I think of Chris Henderson and his, how many, Chris, projects, renewable energy projects with developing countries? 200. Nobody knows that. What we know are the things that don't work. I invite you to read his book. That's what he's done almost full-time for the last 4 or 5 years, is to work with small Indigenous communities to build their own energy supply. So there's lots of that stuff around. And I don't think it obviously doesn't make it into the public discourse in a way it can. And if it does, then we won't just concentrate on the things that blew up in our face and concentrate on the fact that we have actually learned something over the last 100 years. And that we might want to try and put that into practice more.
So we have 2 more questions. Time is beginning to run tight, so I'd like to invite each of you to give a brief question. We'll take both of them and then get some responses from the panel before closing. Go ahead.
George Green. I'm focused on Bruce's comment about the risk-reward equation. So the question to the panel is, how do you bring people who are at the interface of the risk-reward equation into decision-making processes so they feel confident with the outcomes?
Second question?
My name is Patrick McCurdy. I'm a professor in the communications department. So I take an active interest in the ongoing sort of media image war, the sort of binary in this debate, sort of for and against oil sands versus tar sands. So my question is, how do we break that binary and have a discussion? How can, I'm a communications scholar, but how can public policy be used to break that, what is an endless sort of image media war? How can public policy intervene in this discussion?
So risk-reward and overcoming binary images. And Jeff, there's lots of time tomorrow. You can jump in tomorrow. Quick responses from the panel. Yeah, Bruce.
On the dilemma in terms of the media, advice that I've given ministers over a fair period of time was always the best public policy is one that actually can be explained, can be backed up and demonstrated that it's a viable one. It may not be the policy wonk, and I've dealt with a lot of my colleagues who are very much technically minded and had to continually remind them that an optimal technical solution may not be the best public policy solution for the very reason you're talking about, is that if you can't explain it and you can't demonstrate that it's effective and a good one, then I don't care how optimal it is. It's not a bad public policy decision.
Other thoughts on either of the questions? Doug?
Well, I just want to pick up on something David said. You know, we were involved, it culminated last year with bringing 3 large new natural gas processing plants on in British Columbia. And they're a little unique because they're run on hydroelectricity. And if you follow that stream of natural gas, and if it went to the coast of British Columbia and was liquefied using partial power from hydro, and landed as LNG in Asia, it would have less than half the carbon content of natural gas liquefied on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And of course, then if you take that natural gas and displace coal, that will cut another 60% of the emissions down. And I think this gets to part of the information issue. I think a lot of people aren't informed of how Canada can play a role that's bigger than just about Canada. It's about the whole world, because there's a whole lot of places where oil and natural gas is produced where you do not have access to hydroelectricity. So this opportunity doesn't exist. But without information about things like that, how can people make balanced decisions? Particularly, as others on the panel have said, if most of the information presented to them is all the cases where something didn't go in the way they wanted it to go, and if that isn't balanced out. So we have to find a way to do this. And the other thing I think we have to find a way to do is how do we get information in front of people and how they get it today. The traditional media is not the way most people make decisions and gather information, but it's now come with this trust problem, which is, where do I find stuff I can rely on, and who can I do that to? And I think with energy, it's been building. Minister Carr talked about the IEA as one, the EIA is another, but we need to have more places where people feel they can go to and find information that they believe has been checked and verified.
Other thoughts on those questions? Well, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity, one thought before we close, when it comes to what do we need to focus on moving forward? What's your number one priority for Canada moving forward when it comes to public confidence issues and strengthening public confidence in energy decision making? And we'll move again from the far end back towards me, if that works for you, Kim.
I guess I think it's critically important that Canada resolves Indigenous issues on a separate track to energy issues. And to me, I sense a real urgency in relation to sustainability of Indigenous communities is as equally as important as energy issues. And I believe there'll be synergies in relation to those issues, especially when you talk about First Nations wanting to get off diesel and do things in their own communities, or even go beyond and be equity participants in major energy projects to develop their own economies. So there's a huge range of solutions there, but I think we can't lose track of that issue either.
Terrific. Bruce?
I'm inspired by the number of people who have raised the issue about energy information, and that is a part of trust. I think it's also ease of access to that information. It needs to be organized in a way that actually answers the questions that are plugged into Google or whatever. And you have to be able to get access to something that's credible, and we have work to do in that area.
Louis?
Nick earlier talked about the silent majority, and for most Canadians, their interest is energy, is when they put the switch on, when they walk in their house, they want the power to be there. They want the lights to go on, they want it to be affordable, they want it to be safe, and that's the scope of their interest in energy. And then there's the prosumers, or the people that are really interested in issues. Naturally, the First Nations, they have vested interest in project development on their lands, and then there's special rights groups or whatever that also have an interest. But for the majority of people, they want the lights to go on, and I think we all have a duty, governments, policymakers, regulators, industry, to make sure that when we make decisions, they're well informed and that we do educate the public. And I'm not saying this in a negative sense, but in the sense that we have a duty to inform, and the dialogue must go on. It's simple as that.
David?
Yeah, I guess the ultimate question for me, sooner or later, we are going to have to move to a low-carbon future. And the science tells us it's certainly no later than 2050. I guess there are two questions. One is that there's no narrative as to what that looks like. We go on and on about a low-carbon economy and so on. There's no vision of what it would look like, what daily life would look like, would people still have jobs, etc. And so there's a need for involvement of perhaps artists and poets trying to look at what the future might actually be for a low-carbon economy. And the challenge, I guess, for Canada is, can you maintain a lively fossil fuel industry at a time when much of the rest of the world is beginning to shift to a different set of energy sources? I was quite taken last week. I hosted a meeting of the Shell scenario people. They've just produced their new scenario called Sky. And they are not predicting, because these aren't predictions, but they're constructing a set of assumptions about peak oil demand being 2025. That's tomorrow. That doesn't bode well for very, very expensive sources of oil as a future. So these are, I'd say, interesting. They're vital challenges for Canada, and we're not having that discussion much at all. And I think if that's what positive energy were to do next, it would be doing everybody an enormous favor.
Thanks, David. We'll write that down somewhere. Doug.
You know, we participated in Generation Energy that Minister Carr kicked off, and one of the things we held is we hosted an event with 70 millennials in our office in Calgary, and these millennials came from NGOs, they came from government, they came from universities, they came from the energy industry, and we had a series of speakers, experts on energy, people from our industry and others. And what was interesting is that these millennials came in and thought they had an understanding and a view. And at the end of the day, they wrote a report which became part of the Generation Energy Dialogue. And one of the first conclusions they came to in that report was, this is such an important topic, it's more important to get it right than to do it fast. And there was a perception coming in that it was just the opposite, that urgency was here. But once they understood the complexity of how energy touches everyone's life and understood that these policy decisions would touch people in many, many ways, that figuring out how to do this right was more important than figuring out how to rush into it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything, but it does mean it's going to take some dialogue. And I agree, how do you take a topic this complex and translate it to ways that people can understand how it touches their life, not only today, but generations from today, and help them see a pathway through that they can make sense of.
Yeah. And yet I think, you know, one of the things that we've seen from the public opinion research is that there's an appetite for that, and there's a sense of optimism and wanting to be engaged in a pragmatic fashion. So I'm conscious of time, but there were just a couple of things I wanted to point out that struck me, and I hope we can continue on these roads over the next day. One that really comes out to me is we need to have the right forums to talk about the right things. And again, we've talked about this at Positive Energy over the last number of years, but I think it's becoming all the more important, notably when it comes to shifts to lower carbon energy systems. I think one of the things that also came forward really strongly for me as well is, you know, it's not just about kind of who decides and what's the process and what do policymakers do and what do regulators do. Yes, those are essential, and I could completely agree, Louis, with the need to get that right. But it's also about the credibility of the process. So whatever that process is, to make sure we've got a process that at the end of the day, people can have the sense, yes, that was a credible process, it's a legitimate process, I had an opportunity to be heard. And that's not just for individuals. I think that's also for corporations, it's also for investors. As you said, Doug, they need to have the sense that they can come into a country and have a good understanding of what the rules of the game are and what's expected of them in that context. So this, I think, gives us lots of grist for tomorrow's discussions. We'll be moving into dinner now. We have a keynote speech from Chief Karina Lewin, who is the Vice Chair of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, so we're really looking forward to that. Dinner will be served very shortly. In the meantime, I would like to invite you to join me in thanking the Armchair Discussion participants for a terrific session. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your dinner and an opportunity to catch up with folks at your table. So we're going to move into our keynote address for the evening. And we're very delighted to have with us this evening as our keynote speaker over the dinner hour, Chief Karina Louie, who is going to be delivering some remarks. She's going to be showing a video, and then she and I will have a conversation afterwards to dig into some of the comments and themes that she's bringing forward. Karina Louie was first elected Chief of the Cheslata Carrier Nation on May 23rd, 2003. The youngest Cheslata person and the third woman ever to hold that position. She has served 4 terms, being re-elected by acclamation as chief in 2015 and again in 2017. She was appointed vice chair of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition in 2015. A graduate of the University of Victoria, Chief Louie has many years' experience in First Nations governance. Her leadership has been a dynamic force in local and regional economic development initiatives and has helped to make her nation a driving force in the northern British Columbia economy. Please join me in welcoming Chief Karina Louie to the stage.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hari Soanzan, Tsaike, Denise, Skaise, Masi Cho for inviting me to this conference. Also Masi Cho to the Algonquin people on whose territory we do business today. I want to thank the University of Ottawa for inviting me here to speak on this very important issue. In particular, I'd like to thank Monica Gattinger for inviting me here. She's been keeping in contact with the Major Projects Coalition and some of the work that we've done and has shown interest, so thank you. And it's also nice to see another Aboriginal leader in the room, Kim Barrett, who has led her community in economic development, and I've heard really good things about all the work that she's done for her community. So it's really nice to see you here. 2 Burns Lake women. British Columbia women, sorry. So we've covered great distances here to come to Ottawa. Cheslata Carrier Nation territory is located semi-remote in north-central interior of British Columbia. So it's quite a trek to get here. We're about 3 hours from Prince George, for those of you that know where Prince George is. And we're happy to make this journey because we have an exciting and a very important story to tell you. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition is changing our people's lives back home. We see a chance for real control and meaningful prosperity. For the first time in generations, we see the opportunity to be in charge of our destiny. We live in an interesting time in history of Canada and its relationship with Indigenous people. For our communities, we are assembling the tools needed to create significant change. I see a historic opportunity for Indigenous groups and communities to collaborate with other orders of government to create a better and shared future. First Nations-led organizations like the Coalition have a central but perhaps unexpected role to play in shaping the future. I will start by outlining the work and the structure of the Major Projects Coalition. Our nations established the Coalition in 2015 with the purpose of converting our legal and constitutional rights into financing well-being and independence. The Coalition is a First Nations-led response that addresses community-level business capacity and resource gaps. We started as a group of 11 First Nations that were looking for equity ownership in major projects in our territories. In only 3 years, the Coalition has grown to a First Nations-led organization of 40 elected and hereditary First Nations. Other nations from across the country are exploring the possibilities of joining with us. We developed a comprehensive suite of economic and environmental technique models that can be used to the benefit of our members. These models, when implemented, will allow major projects to proceed with our involvement and, most importantly, with sustainable First Nations ownership. Our elders have told us to build economic opportunities for our youth and for our communities. The major projects allows us to move forward. Our mandate is non-political and business-focused. We provide development, project approval, and investment models for consideration by our members. They can implement these models as a single community or, more likely, as a consortium of nations. Communities retain their autonomy to make decisions. The coalition does not impose ideas, speak on behalf of the interests of communities, or negotiate for them. The coalition does not favor or oppose any specific kind of development project. We provide the technical support for the services and the capacity support to our members upon request. We help them achieve their goals and their plans. The group does not oppose or will not, the group does not impose its will or priority on any of our members. Our collaborative and transparent structure makes it possible to provide vital technical services to a large number of First Nations dispersed over a wide geographical area. In particular, in the area that we're talking about, the geographical area is spread quite vastly. With financial support provided to the coalition by the Government of Canada and the Province of British Columbia, we are able to provide services to support informed decision-making amongst our communities free of charge. The model of sharing the skills, sharing the risks, and sharing benefits will give our neighbors our nations the ability to participate when and as they wish in an economy that prospers on their land. Never again will development occur without us, around us, and without our active participation. We plan to be partners in carefully managed, environmentally sound economic development. On this note, I'd like to take the time to recognize the support we have received from Minister Jane Philpott, Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, and Minister Catherine McKenna to continue this work. The federal government continues to collaborate and be responsible to the needs of our members, and does most recently the Government of British Columbia, who has stated they see value in their relationship with our coalition and our willingness to collaborate. Our structure as a nation-based and community-driven organization has attracted the interest of First Nations in other parts of Canada. We are building towards becoming a national organization. At our March annual general membership meeting, members of the coalition moved to create an extra provincial caucus, enabling First Nations in other parts of Canada to join our coalition. I can speak with great passion about the work the coalition does, however, how we are structured and why the coalition is so important. But to fully appreciate the significance of the coalition, you really need to see this process in action and hear from others about the value it adds. I'd like to show a short video presentation. This presentation was shot during our last meeting at our membership meeting in Prince George, British Columbia.
does is they facilitate meetings between industry, government, and other proponents, investors that are looking to develop in.
Creator, bless these gathered here today with understanding, forgiveness, and patience, and may we always see the good in one another and treat each other with respect. Amen.
We have been able to assemble a list of industry representatives who have traveled to be here today and to share their work with us and to listen to our priorities related to major project development.
I'm Charlene Gale. I'm chair of the First Nation Major Projects Coalition. I'm also a councillor for Fort Nelson First Nation. First Nations across Canada are saying that they need to be part of major development happening in their territories, not only to close the social economic gaps, but the infrastructure gaps. What the coalition does is they facilitate meetings between industry, government, and other proponents, investors that are looking to develop in their lands.
We are primed for partnerships. We are designed for partnerships.
I'm Philip Dugan, Vice President of Business Development for Canada for Barrett Development Partners. We create the electricity businesses of the future. We need local partners to push projects forward. We know that First Nations want to drive forward renewable energy development. We've got the expertise to do that, and we think that they're the best local partner you could have.
We're really focused across the country and more recently in the United States on wind, hydro, solar, and more recently storage development.
I'm Jason Edwardy. My role is Director of Community and Indigenous Affairs at Blue Earth Renewables. I think that the value of the coalition is that it's providing support to so many communities, now totaling 40 different First Nations. It just makes it easy to come to an educated and well-resourced group of nations that have come together, all for the same purpose. They're looking for deals, they're looking to work with business, and they want to do it right.
These public-private partnerships, or P3s as we call them, are not a panacea.
My name is Mark Romoff, and I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. Well, the mandate of my organization is really to work with governments and Indigenous communities across Canada to help them really make better investments in infrastructure in order to get the very best outcomes for communities. It's a very good point you're making because it's an opportunity for First Nations communities across the country to take an equity position, and so all of a sudden they've got a stake in the project.
So my name is Angel Ransom. I'm from Nakazli Watan. I'm from the Kwamba Watan clan, which is the Caribou clan, and I'm the Environmental Stewardship Technical Team Lead. We conduct research, we create tools for the communities. The Environmental Stewardship Framework will get major project coalition members the tools they need when they need them in ways that make a difference in protecting lands, waters, and ways of life.
My name is Ricardo Toledo, and I am a member of EAO once again, the Environmental Assessment Office, as in the position of acting Executive Director for First Nations Relations, has a mandate to revitalize the environmental assessment process to ensure the legal rights of First Nations are respected. We can directly say that this will result in changes. We will be making changes. We will be implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
When we think about a major project, we think about how can we preserve and also create renewable resources so that we can leave something for future generations. I think it's so important that Canadians understand the things that First Nation people have gone through over the past 100 years, and to see provincial and federal policy change to incorporate Indigenous values when looking at UNDRIP and the 10 principles that have been passed down by the Minister of Justice is so important that we start thinking that way as Canadians.
We've got a number of equity or partnerships that are quite significant. I will suggest that we must improve that. And it is currently a narration that prosperity in Canada means prosperity for all folks. It's more than just an equity stake in the regional. It means a really deeper dive across Canada. What does that lens look like to share the prosperity to all Indigenous people all across Canada?
This isn't just a regional initiative, this is a national initiative. Like I said, First Nations across Canada are saying that they need to be involved in major infrastructure that's happening in their communities.
My name is Derek Fox. I'm the Deputy Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Nation.
I'm here to talk about the First Nation Sovereign Wealth Fund. So you have the Ring of Fire, you have WATE, you have the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and they all need our support as advocates, as leaders. We have these vast resources in the north, the Ring of Fire. WATE is just getting started. Like many of our leaders, we're very passionate about the same thing, which is a better lives for our people, better lives for our young people.
Our role is strictly financial in terms of providing advice to get our clients the best, cheapest source of capital, the highest level of ownership. PwC is financial advisor to the First Nations as well as to the project. And we have been working with Wataynikaneyap for 5 years.
Wataynikaneyap, we worked with our elders to help us name the project. Hi, I'm Margaret Kennequanash from North Caribou Lake First Nation. I am the CEO of Wataynikaneyap Power. Wataynikaneyap Power is a transmission company that's owned 51% by 22 First Nations and 49% by our partner Fortis. And the goal of Wataynikaneyap Power is to connect remote First Nations to the transmission grid. Our First Nations are working towards controlling and benefiting from a major infrastructure within our territory. At the same time, how do we develop the model, financial model of a project that will create that benefit meaningful way and also create that capacity.
The opportunity to work with a group like the Coalition, who's very focused on making sure that Indigenous communities can really make headway in addressing their own economic issues, for us, this is a natural partnership.
Who better to have than, as your partner than people that have been on the land for 10 or 15,000 years?
As a First Nation leader, I am so proud of the work of the Coalition. Now we are seeing a new light on how we can move forward in this economy, how we can look after our people by working together.
I would encourage the Coalition to continue to work together, set a standard of expectation, to be part of any major infrastructure in our homelands and to have a say in that major infrastructure with industry, governments is so important in creating a future and benefit for our future generation. So stay together and kudos to all of you for the work that you do.
Thank you. As you've just seen, the work that is going on within the Coalition is setting a new benchmark for Indigenous economic engagement and empowerment. As a chief of my community, I can't tell you how encouraging it is to see our neighbors working together to advance our commonly held interests. Through this, we will change forever the way business is done within our lands. We now have a forum where our elected and our hereditary chiefs and leaders can gather to discuss the business properties. For a long time, our communities have not seen eye to eye. We work in isolation and often against each other. The historic division has perpetual effects in our communities can be overcome. The work the Coalition does shows this can be done. As many in this room will know, the last federal budget identified resources to strengthen the capacity and the independence of Indigenous communities. To be truly effective, both of these initiatives require that Indigenous communities work together. Policy decisions moving forward must recognize the value that the nation's ability and willingness to collaborate brings to Indigenous capacity building and informed business decisions. It is central to our ability as a people to achieve self-determination and self-reliance. We have had generations where our small size, our isolated locations, the limited resources weakened our power and undermined our effectiveness. The Coalition is built on the idea that collective action makes us stronger. Our ability to have access to professional capacity and institutional support is becoming increasingly important. particularly as the federal government moves to sunset the Department of Indigenous Services, as Minister Philpott has stated. The government is committed by their words and deeds to creation of a rights reconciliation framework, the integration of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples with Canadian laws, the creation of a new fiscal relationship with the Crown, and a new way of delivering infrastructure to our communities. All of these initiatives require that our communities have access to the resources to engage. We alone can determine what this new reality means to us and how success can be achieved. Furthermore, the work of the Coalition will allow us to shape how and when development occurs within our territories. In our view, Canada needs to support development policy and set funding priorities in full collaboration with Indigenous communities. Only in this way can we arrive at a shared process that creates the certainty around new projects. I want to focus in for a moment on the connection between the work of the Coalition and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP for short. The Coalition and its services are, in design and executed, inspired by UNDRIP. The Coalition is showing how the government can structure their interactions with Indigenous governments to live up to the principles of the Declaration. These interactions should, and rightfully so, challenge the status quo and bring about dramatic and sustainable change. The presence of the Coalition and other First Nations-led initiatives show that UNDRIP matters in the lives of Indigenous people. The prospect for significant change also generates fear of the unknown. Consider the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. The Coalition addresses these principles in the context of the major projects development. It provides a foundation for shared decision-making processes between Indigenous governments, other orders of government, and proponents backing development within our traditional territories. We often hear the Prime Minister and the members of his cabinet say that the environment and the economy can be balanced. We can get to that balance by working together. But working together is what matters the most. Our tools and our models ensure that the traditional and the cultural interests of our members can also be balanced with the commercial requirements. We are tired of being poor. We're tired of being dependent financially on the government. We can and will use financial prosperity to support our self-determination and self-reliance. This work is operationalized by the Coalition through 3 cornerstone process documents. 1, a model ownership toolkit. 2, an environmental stewardship framework and project assessment standards document. 3, a project identified and capacity support criteria document containing a project scoring criteria. This is, in essence, a First Nations definition of what a major project is to our members. Governments and project proponents need to understand that the work of First Nations is well underway. We will administer our own affairs and advance our own future. Our nations are ready and have been ready to act. We also have to inform government about our needs and provide them with a roadmap that will allow us to develop these collective skills. Likewise, governments can assist the process by engaging groups like the Coalition in technical discussions. This often takes place at a political level or through time-consuming and expensive negotiations. We also need these partnerships in the operational level within the bureaucracy. working with departments and central agencies in an open and a collaborative manner. Some departments are open to this engagement. We have had a great exposure to, for example, with the Aboriginal Law section of the Department of Justice. Senior officials of the department have taken the time to meet with the coalition. They have shown a willingness to understand our needs. At the same time, we must be realistic. Change of this magnitude will not come easy. We need to exercise tolerance and understanding as we address the challenges that lay ahead. There will be missteps along the way by our nations and by other governments. But if we stick to our resolve to advance change, we will accept occasional errors, provided that the spirit of collaboration remains strong. I believe I will get to see the day where our communities will get to a place where we have the tools necessary to join the economic mainstream of Canada. We will harness a portion of the wealth being generated from our own lands. Our people will be sitting on the boards of the corporations working within our territories. We will be equity owners. Our communities will be submitting permits and applications for project development jointly. This will all occur because we have engaged each other early and often and work according to our mutual interests. We call on governments and project proponents to support our efforts to capitalize on this new reality. We ask them to collaborate with us to build a sound technical approach to the policy options for change that our First Nations Major Projects Coalition is bringing forward. A new future, one based on Indigenous rights, autonomy, prosperity, is within our grasp. In closing, I'm reminded of the words of the late Chief Justice Lamar. As he read the ruling at the Supreme Court of Canada judgment on Delgamuukw, he said, "Let us face it, we are all here to stay." So as we move forward in an era of collaboration between Indigenous communities, governments, and the private sector, we all know that there will be many challenges. In dealing with these challenges, let us not forget the meaning of those words. We have a shared future. Let us base it on shared decision-making and shared prosperity. Masicho awatsa. Thank you for listening to me tonight.
We have to call up the podium moving muscle here. Great, thank you. So Chief Lewin has kindly agreed to answer a few questions. What I really enjoyed about your talk, Chief Karina, even more so hearing it live than having had an opportunity to see it before you delivered it tonight, is just how in line it is with what we heard energy leaders saying in the armchair discussion. We need positive stories. We need to be looking at what are the things that we can do to move forward positively. So thank you so much for that. Very, very inspiring words. One of the things in your remarks, right at the very outset, you talked about how long it took you to travel to be here with us today. Why did you feel it was important to be with us today and to make the trip?
Yeah, it was, I'm sure Kim can attest to it, to come across it takes so many hours of traveling, sacrifices, leaving your families at home and all those things. But it's important to get the message out about what the coalition does. That's why when Nilo asked me to come here, you had asked Nilo if I could present here. I was like, we were coming anyways.
Well,
so,
now
yeah, we were coming, but it was just an honor to be asked to address as a keynote speaker, because the word really needs to get out to the general public about what kind of tools are out there that will allow some of the questions that were being asked on the panel earlier to be answered. Because some of the questions, I was sitting I was like, that's what we're doing. And so it's really important to acknowledge that there are tools out there that we can use together. And having international and national interest in what the coalition does just proves that some of those tools and the message is getting out there. So it's important to keep it, to keep the message at the forefront of our First Nations people, as well as our proponents, and as well as government. And that's why I'm here tonight.
Well, we're very grateful that you
Mercy.
made the journey. You touched on the division within Indigenous communities. I think, you know, and if there's one thing that we're seeing actually with the latest controversy over the Trans Mountain Pipeline is that there isn't a homogeneous opinion either within or between Indigenous communities. And you touched on your remarks about how the coalition in its work over the last very short period of time has actually worked to build bridges between communities that are often divided. What drives, or in the British Columbia context, what drives division between communities, or what has driven division between communities, and how does the work of the coalition help to overcome that?
The main area that I see as a leader, and I'll only speak for myself and my community and the communities around me, is the situation with our governance structure. We need more capacity back home to develop the abilities to work together. It's an internal thing, but it's also a governance structure. Having lived under DIA's rule for so many years, it almost becomes a part of our everyday living back home. So with the coalition's help, we've been able to take, which is not heard of in our area, 40 First Nations that are actually supporting each other in working together, complementing each other, and providing the knowledge that needs to come into a governance structure for our people.
Mm-hmm. You've also been clear in the remarks that you made, and I think it's probably related, but I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on this, that the coalition is a First Nation-led technical organization and not a political body. What is the relevance of that, the fact that it's not a political body in terms of the success of the coalition's work?
The coalition was first started by 11 First Nations that wanted to become proponents or partners in the pipeline, and could not access the capital to make it a sustainable project. So they went to the Financial Management Board in Vancouver and asked for help. One of the things and the biggest message that those leaders gave to the development of the coalition was that it would be a non-political body, so that the true issues would come to the table and they wouldn't be clouded by political interference of any kind. So it was one of the requests of our leaders in the nations.
And it's continued that way since that time then?
Absolutely.
Oh. Yeah. Terrific. What can government, you alluded to it a bit in your remarks, but what can governments do, both provincially and federally, to continue to support the work that the coalition is doing?
Continue to provide the capacity support that we need to carry on. We continuously negotiate as a board and a technical team to access the supports financially, technically around the coalition carrying on. We've started a process right now. We've got 40 First Nations on board in a short period of time, like you mentioned, and we have to keep that process working. So policy development as well as legislative support around what the governments can provide for us and how they can support us additionally to our technical supports that we already have at hand would be great.
Great. Last question, and I'd like to bring it to your community. What is the history between your nation, like Chislata Carrier Nation, and resource development, and why did your community choose to become a member of the coalition?
First of all, our community chose to be a member of the coalition because of the technical support that is available, the advice that we get through the Major Projects Coalition, which is again a free service. is very important, especially my community is a small community. It's semi-isolated, and we have an 85% employment rate. And that is, it's kind of unheard of in our area, but it's because we have that drive from our community to succeed. We, again, like I said, we don't want any more handouts. So the coalition provides the advice that we need to enter into negotiations to create a major projects in our area. And we have one particular pilot project which is on the tables right now, and it's called the Kenny Dam Water Release Facility. In 1952, Rio Tinto Alcan had flooded us out of our territory with 2 weeks' notice to pack up and move. So the land that has been flooded continues to flood yearly because there's no release for the water. So they just massively release it, and then it refloods our territory. So the Kenny Dam Water Release Facility for the Chislata Carrie Nation would provide an environmental fix to that problem, but also we'd like to see it as being an economical project. As far as other industries, like I said, we're located in a semi-remote area, so we don't have the novelty of a highway running through our territory. We have very little economic development opportunities, but we do participate fully in the forestry industry, which has kept our band afloat, but we also ensure that our environmental impacts, footprint on the ground are, we participate in that so that we're not over harvesting in our area, and that the water, birds, they're all part of what we do, try to do, keep in mind for the environment as well as the economy development.
Terrific. Chief Lewin, thank you so much for making the journey to be here. Thank you very much for answering these questions, and I'd like to invite everyone to join me in thanking you.
Thank you. Masicho.
So we will see you here bright and early tomorrow morning. You all have your program. You know what's ahead of you. We'll look forward to seeing you for breakfast, and then we'll get started right away promptly at 8:30. Thanks so much. Bye for now.